Welcome everyone to our press conference, Women Leading a Fossil Fuel Phase-Out and a Just Transition. My name is Osprey Oriole Lake, and I am the founder and executive director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, or WECAN. And I want to thank our esteemed speakers for joining us today and for your vital work that you're doing all over the world in leadership. I'm going to make a few comments and then hand the floor to all of you. But first, I want to introduce Ariel Deringer. She's Athabasca Chippewa First Nation and Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action from Canada. And sitting next to her is Zipporah Berman, who is the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, also from Canada. And then we'll be hearing from Lorraine Chiponda. She's the co-convener of Don't Gas Africa from Zimbabwe. And we have another guest who's coming to be on the panel shortly, and I'll introduce her when she arrives. Frontline women and global advocates are building critical strategies for national and international divestment from harmful extractive industries, while also calling for justice and accountability from both financial institutions and governments. It's far past time for investments and global economies to move forward on a just transition that places people and planet first. To contextualize the urgency of this moment, since the signing of the Paris Agreement, the world's 60 largest banks have provided $5.5 trillion in financing to the fossil fuel industry. And a report by the UN Environment Program found that governments still plan to produce more than double the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 than what would be consistent with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. We simply cannot continue with these impossible, dangerous numbers. It has to stop. Where is the government regulation? Where are the political leaders standing up to the fossil fuel industry? We're at COP28, and we're seeing such a struggle with the fossil fuel industry. More and more reports about how many fossil fuel industry lobbyists are here, over 2,000, I think it's up to 2,500 almost at this point. So we need our political leaders to stand up to the fossil fuel industry, and we need real commitments from governments and financial institutions to phase out fossil fuels and invest in a just transition. And none of these words that are put in front of the phase out, the adjectives have got to go, unabated, etc. Many groups are organizing for strategic campaigns to call for divestment, to stop fossil fuel infrastructure and extraction at the source. And at WECAN, we work from various angles for this divestment from fossil fuels and phase out, which includes meeting face-to-face with financial institutions. We have found this to be a very effective strategy, and we urgently need to stop the flow of money to the fossil fuel industry, both from financial institutions, and we also need government regulation, because we must move at this point to renewable regenerative energy and community-led solutions that respect human and Indigenous rights. And I just wanted to share some of the reports that we've put out this week. One is called The Gendered and Racial Impacts of the Fossil Fuel Industry in North America and Complicit Financial Institutions, where we go into many different case studies and name names of companies and banks that are involved. And we must understand that not everyone is feeling these impacts equally. There is a gendered and racial lens to how the fossil fuel industry is impacting women's bodies and people of color and Indigenous people. WECAN has also been very concerned about really addressing the global economic system as we continue to see disaster capitalism play out in real time. And it's imperative to transform the system and call for a regenerative, rights-based economy that prioritizes communities and nature. And this includes demilitarization. This is something that has really come forward at this COP, because all of these different struggles we are in are connected. We must move away from a war economy, a fossil fuel economy, to a regenerative economy that cares for people and planet. And in this context, I want to share that WECAN has just released our report called Prioritizing Care Work and How It Can Unlock a Just Transition for All. Because we need to start looking at different types of economies. And within this report, we talk about things like women's unpaid care that they're providing, underpaid care, and how this is part of decarbonizing our economy, is that if we actually start paying women for the work that they're doing, we're going to have a very different set of economies, and this is critical to the transition that we're looking at and demanding from governments. And this includes the prioritizing of care. It is also talking about different social frameworks, Indigenous knowledge, staying within models that do not support an endless economic growth model, talking about buen vivir, which draws upon Indigenous knowledge and how to live in harmony with the land, or donut economics, which outlines a model for living within planetary boundaries. So there's a lot of different systems that we need to really bring forward and intervene into the current systems that are pushing forward here at the COP with false solutions that are going to continue business as usual. And we don't want this. So we are also talking about our definition of a just transition and what that looks like. And lastly, this is the COP where global movements are strengthening ever more our demand for fossil fuel phase out. And as we make this demand, we also know that it's essential to make clear what these false solutions are, including dangerous or unproven techno-fixes, carbon offset schemes that don't work, net zero pledges that delay immediate action, amongst others. So we're very concerned about the narrative that is here, even with these net zero pledges, because net zero scientifically is a correct concept, but not in how it's been co-opted. And because of this, WECAN is releasing a policy analysis called The Need for Real Zero, not Net Zero, shifting from false solutions to real solutions and a just transition. And it details these vital issues for people to really learn more about, because I think there's a lot of confusion about what we're talking about with net zero. And we need to move quickly, but we also need to move equitably and with real solutions that are going to care for people and planet. Included in this policy analysis is the need for governments to negotiate and implement a Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So this is part of this report, and you'll be hearing more about the treaty from Zipporah Berman in a moment. And WECAN is really honored to be serving on the steering committee for the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and we think it's absolutely necessary mechanism to complement the Paris Agreement. It's far past time to invest in the plethora of successful community-led solutions that will lead us to a healthy and equitable future, and I think our best hope is in women leading the way. Women are leading the way in so many of these movements for a just transition and the fossil fuel phase out. And I'm really honored to share this press conference with some of the most amazing women leaders I know who are really standing forward in this phase out and this call to move off of fossil fuels. And with that, I'd like to hand the floor to you.
Iglanite, Dene Sotlaneta, Ariel Tseekwe Hushe, Deranger Betsini Hesli. My name is Ariel Tseekwe Deranger, and I am Dene, or Dene Sotlane, from the community of Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, which is located in the Treaty 8 territories of Northern Alberta in so-called Canada. My community is an Arctic community, and we are not only feeling the brunt of climate change, but we are also experiencing some of the worst consequences of the oil and gas industry. Indigenous communities hold a profound wealth of knowledge about living in reciprocal relations with our lands and waterways, stewarding the ecosystems we all depend on, and adapting to the big changes over time. At this moment of climate crisis, we should be focusing on reinvigorating, practicing, and sharing our long-held traditions of care of the lands. These are the real climate solutions. And when we talk about the impacts of oil and gas and why we need a phase out of oil and gas all across the globe, is because this is not just about the reduction of emissions at source. This is also about the reductions of the harms and the violence Indigenous peoples have felt on our lands and our bodies and our communities. My community has been inundated with oil and gas for the last 60 years, where we have seen our lands and territories eroded and degraded for the profits of multinational corporations that have reaped billions of dollars off of our lands and territories. Our lands have been polluted, our waterways contaminated, our food sources driven off, where we've seen the decline of keystone species like bison go from decline over 80% in the last 20 years. We have seen almost the complete extinction of a genetically unique bison herd. We have seen the disappearance of fish, other migratory birds, and keystone species that our communities have relied on since time immemorial. All of this has amounted to food insecurity, land insecurity, cultural insecurity. When we talk about a phase out of fossil fuels, we also have to talk about not just the impacts on our lands and territories, but to our bodies. As Indigenous peoples, we've also felt the contamination in our own bodies, where we have seen higher cases of autoimmune diseases, soft tissue cancers, and other rare forms of cancer in our community. In addition to this, our communities are also experiencing the onset of violence against women, including an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. All of this taking into account that we are seeing the influx of migratory workers into our territories, where we are seeing man camps, where this is associated with the violence that we're seeing on our communities. We need to demand a phase out of fossil fuels, not only to reduce emissions at the source. We have seen billions of dollars being invested into false solutions that are giving loopholes for this industry to continue business as usual in many parts of the world, including in my own home territories. We cannot afford to do this. G7 countries are out here trying to say that they are global leaders on climate change when they are doubling down their investments in many cases, like my own country, and approving projects that don't even come online until 2026 and have a 60 to 80-year life cycle. This is not climate leadership. This is climate suicide. We need to demand real leaders that are willing to step up and demand a phase out of fossil fuels, not promises of caps and emissions that have no substantial meaningful processes that are actually going to reduce emissions at the source. We cannot have climate justice without human rights and Indigenous rights. We must work together to demand that all of our people work together and ensure that we are phasing out of fossil fuels and stopping emissions at the source. Thank you. Masi Cho.
Thank you so much. And before I hand the floor to Zipporah, I just wanted to welcome Mitzi Janelle Tan. Thank you for joining us. She is the convener and international spokesperson for Youth Advocates for Climate Action in the Philippines. Thank you so much for joining us. We all come from an action, so we're racing over here, an action for climate justice and a ceasefire. Please go ahead, Zipporah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Osprey. You didn't tell me I was going to have to go after Ariel. Look, after decades of climate negotiations, fossil fuels have finally been dragged center stage at COP. It's incredible that we're at COP 28, and this is the first climate negotiations where we're having a significant conversation about fossil fuels. The climate crisis is a fossil fuel crisis. And despite the fact that fossil fuels are finally center stage here at COP, many of our governments are not only still approving new oil, coal, and gas projects, threatening our chances of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but in fact they came here to COP to make oil deals. They're making a mockery of this process at a critical moment in history. It's crystal clear. We need a concrete, binding plan to end the expansion of new coal, oil, and gas projects and manage a transition away from fossil fuels. As we move closer to the finish line for this COP, the global stocktake text has made some progress. And I think in some ways that progress is historic. That we're actually hearing countries on the floor of the United Nations actually talk about phasing out fossil fuels, finally. It still, however, doesn't include language on the need for equity by requiring developed countries to phase out first, or that financial support is needed for developing countries to undertake a clean energy transition. Developing countries have been very clear on the floor that differentiated phase-out timelines and funding are essential prerequisites for them to agree to text on a fossil fuel phase-out. What we've been seeing in these negotiations, I think, can be summarized as the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that many countries have had strong statements in support of a phase out of fossil fuels in line with the science and the 1.5 degree target, and a full phase out of fossil fuel subsidies. The EU, Samoa, the Holy See, Fiji, Chile, Colombia, Brazil, Marshall Islands, and others have all made those statements on the floor. We've also seen countries link the new commitments to expand renewable energy to displacing fossil fuel infrastructure. This is critical. The atmosphere doesn't care how much renewable energy we build unless it's displacing fossil fuel infrastructure and projects. That has to be linked, and for too long we've been having conversations about increasing the good but refusing to stop expanding the bad. It is not a transition if we're continuing to grow the problem. The bad, we continue to see terms like unabated and inefficient being proposed by countries for the text. For decades, the fossil fuel industry has been trying to make their products invisible in climate policy and in international negotiations. This has been a strategy to decouple emissions from production so that climate policy and agreements don't constrain their profits and don't constrain fossil fuel production. The terms unabated and inefficient are not just qualifiers, they're not just terms. This is a tactic by the most powerful industry on Earth to continue to keep us from climate progress. And the data shows that it's impossible to abate fossil fuel emissions, and even the IEA recently found that global CCS projects have yet to deliver substantial progress, and they've dramatically reduced their estimates of potential use of CCS. So has the IPCC, so has the Energy Transition Commission report that just came out. What we build today is what we will use tomorrow. The ugly, I want to finish with that. Because what we saw here today at COP was the ugliest I have ever seen, and I've been to 16 COPs. Countries opposing even using the term fossil fuels, but more than that, a secret letter from OPEC leaked. OPEC's decision to reach out to member countries and ask them to block action on fossil fuels at this COP was a desperate and unprecedented intervention in the climate negotiations. They are panicking. They are panicking because we're finally having the fossil fuel conversation, and because 11 nation states are now calling for a fossil fuel treaty, an equitable and wind-down plan for how to manage the wind down in a way that leaves no country or community behind. This proposal is gaining speed, not just here at COP, but around the world. And countries that are serious about meeting the science will not only support strong language at Paris, at COP, but they will support a companion to the Paris Agreement, a fossil fuel treaty that ensures we have a plan for managing the wind down of fossil fuels. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please go ahead, Lorraine.
Thank you very much. For the past 100 years plus, Africa is engaged in a fossil fuel energy system that has not benefited the continent. The fossil fuel energy system has been characterized by energy apartheid, where up until now, after more than 100 years, 600 million people in Africa still remain in energy poverty. 1 billion people still don't have access to clean cooking. Fossil fuel energy projects in Africa have resulted in a plethora of rights issues, including displacement from land, displacement from livelihoods, displacement and disposition of family household income. The dash for gas in Africa has not changed the narrative around the fossil fuel energy system. We're still seeing gas corporations mapping out Africa into pipelines that are meant for export of energy, and still African communities are still excluded from the fossil energy, from accessing energy. So when we talk about a transition as African people, we are demanding a transition that is not only technical, but takes into consideration the historical implications of the past energy system. We are demanding for the just in the just transition, whereby land rights are acknowledged, whereby the 600 million people living in energy poverty have access to energy, whereby energy systems are compatible with our food systems, with our water systems. And again, we are demanding for an equitable global finance architecture, which again ensures that Africa can actually transition. Corporations and rich nations have depleted the carbon budget, and we are demanding that they contribute towards Africa's just transition by ensuring that Africa and poorer nations have got the necessary climate finance. At this moment, Africa is only receiving 3% of the total climate finance meant for the transition. So again, when we push for systems change, we want transformation of the systems in terms of energy access, in terms of affordability of the energy. Energy should not be seen as a commodity where corporations come to Africa, extract energy, export it to richer nations, while East Africa remains with energy poverty and a devastated environment which does not sustain our livelihoods. We are demanding of recognition of energy as a right, because tied to the right to energy is also other forms of rights, including the ability to attain our livelihoods, the ability even to go to school, because without energy, people can't even access electricity to be reading or to be doing various other aspects required by energy. So we are demanding a revamp of the total energy system. We do not want to see a technical shift from clean from fossil fuels to clean, but a change in behavior. We are also urging richer nations to adopt a principle of degrowth, because it is the rampant consumption which has led again to the plunder of African communities and the African environment. So we are urging even our allies, countries in the global north, to adopt and to curb over consumption and adopt a concept of degrowth, to allow the earth to replenish. Because even if we move towards a renewable energy, is still going to result in export of raw, cheap commodities from African countries, who at this point host 40% of the transition minerals that are required. So again, we do not want to see the same characteristics that we have been fighting, the same injustices that have been perpetuated by the fossil industry and the fossil fuel energy system. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your comments. It's so critical that we understand that we don't want to just phase out fossil fuels. I think we also want to phase out this entire systems that's not working. Please go ahead, Mitzi.
As Osprey mentioned earlier, we all just came from the Global Day of Climate Action, where we went on the streets here inside the UN Climate Summit to demand for a fossil fuel phase-out that's just and fair, and the ceasefire. And I often get asked, why are these two things connected? Why do you talk about peace and militarization and fossil fuels and climate change all in the same sentence? But as our previous speaker was just saying, it's because it's all part of this system that has turned people of color, people in the global south, into resources to be used, has turned nature into a resource to be used rather than something that we are a part of. The fossil fuel industry has hurt us for far too long, both in the terms of emissions, but also causing a lot of wars and militarization, and also as environmental defenders go up against these fossil fuel industries, especially the mining industries that's with coal, oil, and gas. Militaries protect the fossil fuel industries, and environmental defenders, especially indigenous peoples, are killed in the process. My country, the Philippines, is one of the most dangerous countries in the world for environmental defenders and activists. And all they're doing is fighting for land, fighting for the planet, fighting against the destructive and extractive industries like the fossil fuel industry. When I first started going on board with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, something that they were using a lot in the first phases of the days in terms of messaging was that fossil fuels is the is this generation's new mass weapon of destruction. And that really hit close to home because I grew up seeing that destruction. I grew up feeling helpless as storm and typhoon and thunder and lightning came banging on our homes every single year, several times a year, seeing entire communities consumed by floods. And I didn't know that there was something that could be done. I didn't know that the fossil fuel industry was behind it because they did this on purpose. They keep us in the dark so that we don't know that they're the ones who's putting us all on fire. And now that they've been brought to light, they're doing every single thing that they can do to try to hide, to try to keep their power, to try to keep their money. But we will not allow this to happen. The young people and marginalized people and the women are leading the way towards a just and renewable and fair and safe and feminist future. And I'm so excited to be in a world where we don't even have to think of fossil fuels because they are in the ground just as we need it to be. And so we're seeing the UNFCCC spaces. We have 2,400 plus fossil fuel lobbyists present at this summit. So we need to be louder, we need to be stronger, we need to all come together because together we are the majority. And we need to see that we need new solutions because 28 years of COP has not brought us that fossil fuel phase out with clear implementation rules, and that's where the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty comes in. And we're seeing countries like Colombia, who is a global south country but can still profit off fossil fuels, signing on. And so my question is to the rich countries, especially countries like the US, what is your excuse? If a country like Colombia, if a country like the Pacific Islands can pledge to a future where we are all safe, why can't you?
So we just have a moment for closing, and I want to thank you all for taking time. Everyone has been very busy at this COP. I really put it in the hands of women leaders that are sitting here to really get down to business and make this change that we all know is necessary. And it is really the critical moment here at this COP where the phase out of fossil fuels is on the table. The fight is here. The OPEC letter that came out that was leaked is outrageous. The interference of the fossil fuel industry, lobbyists that are here. So make no mistake, for those of you who are listening that are not here, this is a true battle that is going on, and we feel it, and we're here. And one of the things that I think is that you can hear from the power of all the women speaking here, representing so many constituencies and others, is that we are fighting, and we are going to win. We are fighting, and we are going to win, because this time at the fossil fuel industry is over. It's over. And it doesn't mean that it's going to go down easily, but it's over. And there are solutions from Indigenous people's rights and Indigenous people's solutions, from the Fossil Fuel Treaty, from our sisters coming from the Global South, all of the solutions that they're already carrying. And the courage that they have is outrageous because of the fact of how the Global North has been acting and the consumerism and the amount of money and fossil fuels that we've put into the air, the emissions that we are responsible for in the Global North, that is now affecting people in countries all over the world that have not been emitting at the same level. So I really appreciate your comments as well on that point, and the fact that where are the wealthy countries? We demand that they take action at this COP. It is time for everyone to get very real, very, very real, and there be an equitable transition off of fossil fuels. And with that, thank you very much, all of you, for your time, and let's continue on at the COP. Thank you.